You ever wondered how we got here? I mean, how did we, the West, come out on top? And by that I mean way before the atomic bombs, before the 20th century, or even the century before that. And most of all, how did Europe not get colonized first? Because when you think about it, Europe was never the grand favorite. For most of human history, it was pretty marginal. A corner of the world where plenty of micro-powers couldn't get along, to the point the continent was in constant state of war, split in cultures, language, environments. Well, thanks to a few books and papers, I'll try to answer these very questions. How did we get here? Why not the other way around? And where the heck are we going? Oh, by the way, if you're wondering, this time around this is my actual voice. If you've been following me for a while now, you know I've done some experiments with it. I hired voiceover artists, I used AI, and so on. Mainly because of, well, my accent. But lately, I've changed my perspective as to this game. I figured that writing, editing, and all the rest wasn't nearly quite enough, and that I needed to put myself out there a bit more. So, if you're here to listen, thanks for staying. And please, go easy on me in the comments. Let's go back. Way back. Before the empires, the kings, the concept of Europe even being a thing. For tens of thousands of years, what we now call Europe was just forest. Dense, cold, wet forest. Dotted with small bands of hunter-gatherers for game, foraging berries, no concept of borders or nations. They didn't farm, they didn't build cities, they didn't write anything down, as most of the world around this time. But this came to an end. Agriculture appeared around 10,000 years ago, then writing about 5,000 years ago, both from the Fertile Crescent. Close, but not Europe. Amazingly, agriculture reached Europe with a 3,000-year lag, and 2,000 years after that, Europe got hit with something massive. A steppe invasion that replaced most of the men and brought horses, cattle, chariots, Proto-Indo-European languages, and what I'd call the warrior drive. The cattle greatly increased protein intakes, boosted milk tolerance, and introduce a whole lot of diseases that come with living in close vicinity to a massive pile of goat feces, like early strains of Yersinia pestis, for example. Everything in their culture was about conflict, pride, and the overall system of patriarchy. The first larger-scale fortified settlements appeared. So when we say Europe was never colonized, we're technically wrong. It was never colonized past the Bronze Age. Writing wouldn't arrive till the Phoenicians and their shit ton of trading posts around 1700 BC, and it wouldn't transfer to European-born populations, aka the Greeks, till the 8th century BC. So again, almost a 2,000-year lag. And yet, you complain when you can get 60 FPS on Elden Ring. But never mind. Rome organized the continent briefly. Roads, aqueducts, Laden, Low. That's my one paragraph summary of the Roman Empire. Please don't trash me in the comments. So when it collapsed in 510 AD, what followed was naturally called the Dark Ages, which, to be fair, wasn't that dark. But when you start the period with year like 536 AD, literally the worst year in human recorded history, it's not hard to see why. As late as the 6th century, Europe north of the Loire was so thinly populated that a plague pandemics it hit far less hard than the urbanized Mediterranean. Not a flex, but in reality it just means there weren't enough people packed together to die efficiently, if we could say that. And it wasn't a single invention that got Europe past this point. It took plenty of smaller ones, improving what Jared Diamond calls energy collecting. Human power, then animal power, then water mills, scaled to thousands by the 10th century, used for grain, for metalwork, clothing, and the most important of all, beer. It was better than nothing. But compared to China, gunpowder, the compass, movable type, there was a gap. Then, in 1346, the Black Death wiped out up to half the population. But, paradoxically, economic historian Eric L. Jones argued this kinda helped the survivors. No knowledge lost, buildings still standing, the church still there. And now that half the population was gone and crops were growing more efficiently, people had better, and labor paid more. A comparable effect to the Marshall Plan without the US and with zero plan actually. So that's the starting line. A continent that didn't invent agriculture, didn't invent writing, got its population replaced by steppe warriors, got briefly organized by Rome and then forgot most of it, spent literally centuries reinventing the basics while China and the Islamic world were running laps around it. And somehow, within 100 years of 1400, this place would begin conquering the planet. Once again, within 100 years. But the other great civilizations weren't exactly twiddling their thumbs either. Between roughly 1000 and 1500 AD, the entire Eurasian continent was reshaped by Turkish and Mongol people pouring out of, you guessed it, the Central Asian steppes. Jones called it the steppe gradient. The Mongol advance killed roughly 35 million Chinese, reduced Persian irrigation to deserts, and spawned the Ottoman, Mughal, and Manchu conquest. All imposed military despotism and revenue pumps. And Europe? Europe west of Hungary got lucky. Succession disputes among the Mongols stopped them in their tracks. They turned around because they were arguing about who should be in charge. That's it. By 1400, China has over 100 million people and the best tech on the planet. Under Mongol successor rule, India produces a quarter of global output. Under Mughal domination, the Ottomans control the eastern Mediterranean, and Europe is still the smallest, the most fractured, the most war-ravaged major civilization. Here's how Diamond framed it. Any historian alive between 8500 BC and AD 1450 would surely have labeled Europe's eventual dominance as the least likely outcome. So what changed? And why didn't any of those bigger, richer civilizations just cross the water and colonize Europe first? They could have. Every single one of them. China, India, the Ottomans had the people, the money, the tech, and in China's case, the actual ships. None of them crossed the water. Not because they couldn't, because something inside their own system wouldn't let them to. Let's start with the most insane case. Decades before Columbus scrapped together 3 tiny ships, China was sending treasure fleets, hundreds of vessels, some 400 feet long, crews of 28,000 men, across the Indian Ocean to East Africa. 7 expeditions between 1405 and 1433, under the eunuch, Admiral Cheng Ho. Sounds impressive, right? But apparently, all Cheng Ho did was go shopping for the ladies of the imperial harem. The imports? Rhinoceros horns, ivory pearls. This wasn't an empire reaching outward to grow. This was a court treating the Indian Ocean like a luxury mall. And then, poof, the emperor died, the government went broke, and here's where it gets truly bizarre. The president and vice president of the War Office literally connived at destroying the records of previous voyages, just to block a eunuch inspector who wanted to mount a new expedition. By 1553, the art of building large ships had been forgotten entirely. The Ming eventually declared all maritime trade illegal. Why? Partly because some disappointed Japanese trade missions turned to piracy, and the easiest fix was just ban everything. India, on its end, had a whole different problem, an equally paralyzing one. Mughal India was basically run by an imposed alien regime. A physician named Bernier, who lived 12 years at the court, wrote that property owners had declined so much as to clean their ditches or repair their house. Why not? because any visible improvement meant confiscation. Each producer surrendered about half his income in taxation. It was literally called eating. Governors were called eaters of provinces. The Punjabi proverb, never stand behind a horse or before an official. Angus Madison concluded that had the Mughal regime persisted, capital formation might have gone negative. Not stagnant, negative. Finally, the Ottomans. Probably the most ironic. A Turkish cartographer drew a map in 1513 showing the Atlantic coast of the Americas based on Portuguese charts and a copy of Columbus's own map. So they knew everything. They just couldn't do anything about it. Underneath the naval failure, the same rot as India. Confiscatory taxes, bribes greasing every wheel, investment money went into shops and bathhouse, things barely worth confiscating, though never quite safe from it either. Much went into the insane Tulip Festival under Sultan Ahmed III. An English traveller named Breakout remarked in 1668 that he had never seen a good map drawn by a Turk. Looking back at it, Adam Smith saw the common thread in the wealth of nations. He said, in these unfortunate countries where men are continually afraid of the violence of their superiors, they frequently bury and conceal a great part of their common stock. Bury and conceal. 3 civilizations, richer, bigger, more advanced, but all stock. See? The interesting thing with having multiple power centers in Europe is that you can basically shop around. Columbus pitched his idea to France, then Portugal, then Medina Sidonia, then Medina Sully, and finally, on his 5th try, Spain said yes. Had Europe been unified under any one ruler, colonization might just never have happened. But Europe was so fragmented that all Columbus needed was one prince out of hundreds to say sure, why not? And that's another interesting concept by Diamond, which he called the optimal fragmentation principle. Too much unity, like China, and one bad decision kills everything. Too much fragmentation and nothing holds together, like India. Europe, almost by geographic accident, landed in a weird, perfect middle zone. Rivers, forests, mountain pockets, all rich enough to support independent states, not enough for one to swallow the others. And that might actually be the most consequential accident in human history. Here's the thing most people get wrong about Europeans sailing out. It all started for basic shit. Captain John Smith, yes, the Pocahontas guy, once wrote, "Let not the word fish the states you, for it will afford as good gold as the mines of Guyana or Potosi." And he wasn't being poetic. Jones' art historians have been more diverted by gold than history was. What Europeans actually sought were fish, whale oil, timber, and land for grain, sugar or grapes, spices eventually, new trade routes if you're lucky. If you take Portugal, tiny, infertile, harvest failing 1 year in 3, needed it more than all the others. Pierre Chonu broke down the motives by class. The bourgeoisie wanted sugar land. The aristocracy just wanted land, period. And the state wanted grain. Henry the Navigator shaped this into what Jones called a space program. Systematic voyages further into the Atlantic and down the African coast. I kinda like the analogy with space. But it wasn't just Portugal being clever. The fall of Constantinople blocked the Bosphorus. Italian money, Genoese especially, started flowing the opposite direction. 2 Genoese ships had tried to sail westward to India in 1291, passing through Gibraltar and just vanishing. By the 15th century, Genoa was backing Spanish expeditions out of Seville. The Atlantic was a rebound. Columbus in 1492, Da Gama in 1498. Before the discoveries, Europe's 80 million people occupied about 3.75 million square miles. Right after, 20 million square miles. Average land per capita jumped from 24 acres to 148, a six-fold gain, so huge gains for Europe, especially since these new lands were really underdefended. After most Native Americans died from germs, though, smallpox reached Mexico in 1520 with one infected slave from Spanish Cuba. By 1618, Mexico's population crashed from 20 to 1.6 million. Pizarro had similarly grim luck in Peru, all thanks to some steppe guys deciding thousands of years ago to live next to their goats, pigs and horses. The Americas never developed drought disease and their population at zero. George Borgstrom introduced a concept Jones picked up, ghost acreage. Say, England imports sugar from Barbados. To grow that same amount of sugar at home, if you even could, you'd need thousands of acres of English farmland. Those Caribbean plantations were, in economic terms, invisible English fields, ghost acreage, and Europe was stacking it up across every climate zone on the planet. Potatoes came in, European horses, cattle and sheep went out. An unparalleled share of Earth's biological resources was acquired for one culture on an unprecedented and unrepeatable scale. What's insane when you think about it is that none of it came from necessity. The Portuguese happened to be fishermen, Genoa cut off from the Black Sea, the Atlantic less dangerous than everyone assumed, the Americas ecologically rich and immunologically defenseless. The discoveries turned the continents inside out. The question now was, what would Europe do and build with everything it had just taken? But resources alone don't explain everything. You need the right system to make the most out of it. Plenty of civilizations have stumbled onto windfalls and squandered them. The Ottomans had spice profits and blew them on tulip festivals, remember? The real question: what let Europe actually convert raw gains into growth? And the answer starts in a very real place. Trinkets. Adam Smith sketched a theory, the bubble thesis. Picture early medieval Europe. Power belongs to men who command army retainers. Then some peddler shows up with silk or jewelry or something shiny the lord's wife wants. The lord now has a problem. If he says the goods, the trader won't come back, but he basically broke. His whole economy runs on land and personal services. So what can you do at that point? Well, he starts requiring cash rent instead of personal services. Retainers becomes tenant. And lord becomes... well, yeah, landlords. Like, not going very far with this one. Now, transactions can happen outside of local services. Towns grow, the system gets more productive. Eventually the lord realizes he's traded his army for an income. What made Europe different, let's say from Ottoman Turkey or Mughal India, where rulers also loved luxury, is what happened around the market once it got going. In Asia, the governor could sweep down and confiscate whatever he wanted. And what will you do about it? Leave? In Europe's fragmented system, if your kingdom was too arbitrary, people just left for the kingdom next door. Bills of exchange made capital flight realistic. You could move your money across borders before the king even noticed. Governments had to sort of behave, almost like businesses competing for customers. Which brings us to Europe's most underrated engine, refugees. And of course, I mean, refugees back then, like, not now. For example, when Protestants fled the Netherlands in 1567, they stiffened workforces across England, Holland and Switzerland. When Antwerp was sacked in 1585, Flemish artisans founded a silk industry in England. The Huguenots, over 200,000 living France around 1685, played key roles in metal production, paper making, textiles. Henri de Portal, smuggled out of France, hid in a wine barrel, founded the firms that steal Prince Bank of England notes, massive involuntary technology transfer. And there's another case. Come on. I know. You know. We all know who we're talking about. As Christians couldn't go into money lending, they took the space. Expelled from England in 1290. Spain after the Conquista. But in politically divided German and Italian states, there were always more frontiers to cross. When Spain expelled them, the Ottoman Sultan Bajazet II supposedly declared they would make him rich at Spain's expenses. And he wasn't wrong, except in the Ottoman system, they operated unprotected by law. In Europe, over time, they gained something approaching institutional protection. Not out of morality, out of competition. A 2001 paper, The Colonial Origins of Comparative Development, put hard numbers on it. Basically, countries with better institutions, more secure property rights, and less distortionary policies invested more and grew richer. No kidding. And critically, early institutions persisted. The institutional DNA, laid down in the colonial period, usually predicted economic performances centuries later. Protecting property and tolerating minorities wasn't really noble. It just ended up being more profitable than just looting them. So Europe built a machine, then exported it globally. Except it didn't export only one machine, it exported two. And which one you got basically decided your next 500 years. You just didn't decide which one you'd get. At one extreme, extractive states. For example, the Congo, like not Belgium's Congo, King Leopold's personal property. Tax rates on Africans hit 60% in the 1920s and 30s, for regimes that approximately gave back nothing. At the other extreme, settler colonies. The US, Australia, Canada, places where Europeans showed up and demanded the same institutions they had back home. Even in Australia, where most early settlers were literal convicts, they fought for legal protections, ex-con demanding constitutional rights. You gotta respect the hustle. But what determined which template you got? There's one simple factor: disease. Where Europeans could survive, they settled and built institutions. And where they died like flies, they set up an extraction pipe and left. First-year European mortality in Sierra Leone, 46%. In Bulama, 61%. On Mungo Park's second expedition in 1805, literally every single European was dead before it was over, him included. The Pilgrim Fathers picked the United States over Guyana, specifically because Guyana would kill them. A British committee in 1795 rejected sending convicts to Gambia because mortality rates were just too high. Guess where they picked instead? In Africa, Europeans mostly hugged the coast. The names tell you everything. The Gold Coast, the Ivory Coast. Nobody called it the Promising Institution Coast. And these institutions stuck. Spain's apparatus of monopolies survived Latin American independence almost unchanged. Slavery in Brazil lasted until 1886. Forced labor persisted in Mexico until 1910. Guatemala until 1945. And in RDC, Mobutu just brought it back, just like that. Settler mortality rates from centuries ago explain over 25% of the variation in today's institutions. Once you control for institutions, being in Africa or near the equator stops being statistically significant. The African dummy in the regulation? Zero. It's not geography, not culture, not latitude, it's institution. So once colonialism installed and independence didn't uninstall. The irony is on a cosmic level. Europe spent centuries accidentally developing a system that constrained rulers and rewarded innovation. because it was too fragmented to do anything else. Then, it deliberately built the exact opposite everywhere the mosquitoes were bad enough. The civilization that escaped the extraction trap turned around and imposed that exact trap on half the planet. The places that got the good template, top right corner of every development scatter plot. The places that got the bad one, still trying to dig out. Colonialism ended. Officially. Flags came down, anthems changed, but the extraction just put on a suit. Those extractive institutions left behind dependencies. Countries with good institutions, no industrial base, desperate need for infrastructure nobody would fund without a sermon. Western aid came wrapped in lectures about governance from people whose own countries had colonized them a century ago. Then, China showed up with a checkbook and a very different pitch. And these countries can relate much more to China than to any Western countries actually. China itself was brought to its knees at the same period and was forced to grant sovereignty in parts of its territories like Hong Kong and Macau. So when they show up and say, "No political strings attached," literally Xi Jinping's words, they listen. The Belt and Road Initiative launched in 2013. Chinese overseas financing has climbed to nearly $2.5 trillion since 2005. Xi visited Pakistan in 2015 and announced $46 billion in support, more than America since 2002. Visited Africa that December, $60 billion in grants, loans and capital. But China isn't that benevolent, just pulling different strings. High interest rates, collateral pledges like land, requirements to use Chinese labor. Ask Sri Lanka how that works. They took loans for a deepwater port at Hambantota. The port flopped. Sri Lanka drowning was compelled to hand over 99-year leases. A local politician called it a Chinese colony. Malaysia stopped taking Chinese loans in 2018 after the Prime Minister described the Chinese-built project as not investment but a settlement. Ecuador locked in 90% of its oil exports to loan repayment. So, is this colonialism in the strict sense? No, the mechanisms are different. The agency of governments is real, but it's close. Very close. The extraction pipe didn't disappear, it just got rebranded as a public-private partnership. And it's not just China. For the US, the dollar itself is the empire. 2/3 of all debt securities issued by corporations outside their home countries are denominated in dollars. The currency is the infrastructure of power. No flag required. A 2025 study built from 373,020 bilateral political events mapped the new world. The old binary shattered. Western alliance still tight. Kinda. China and Russia on their own pole. And in between, India, Turkey, Brazil, Mexico. What we call connector states threading between blocks. You can build a wall when half the world won't pick a side.
I'm gonna play both sides.
That same study priced geopolitical friendship. One improvement, like tends to cordial, adds about 10.5% to GDP over 20 years. If you go the full distance from hostile to cooperative, and the gain hits 70 points. The growth doesn't care whose hand you shake. Ideology is irrelevant. Friendship is GDP. If you flip the coin though, Belarus and Russia have lost an estimated 20 to 30% from isolation.
This is fine.
The 2010s were actually the first decade where geopolitical change turned net negative for global GDP. The golden era peaked around 2005. The US-China relationship has cratered to early Cold War levels, except now we're in a circulatory system. It's like trying to divorce someone who's literally inside your bloodstream. As they stand now, things are getting more and more intricate, despite the visceral animosity between them. What's funny is that you can find some parallels between 15th century Europe and its fragmentation and the world now. Technology in the banking system has shrunk the world to the point transferring capital and property is about the same, if not easier actually. Concurrence is even higher, and states that live solely thanks to very lenient tax systems are a thing now. Demography will also change the dynamics further. China is facing an estimated population decline of 204 million people by 2054. And that's how you end up with 2 or 3 major blocs that have different things to value. US claims absolute freedom. China is betting on heavy investments. Basically, freedom is good if you only get to eat every day. Other blocs are of lesser influence, let's say, but still exist. Europe is separating more and more as Trump's presidency is going forward. The Islamic world is leaning on cultural and religious values, and the connectors are opportunistic in the middle, waiting for the best offer. And this is where we finally circle back to our questions. Is this the kind of fragmentation that produces Silicon Valley, or the kind that produces world wars? As Diamond wrote, a degree of political fragmentation that is optimal for technological innovation may not be optimal for economic productivity, political stability, or human happiness. The extraction pipe mutated into debt diplomacy. Colonial governors became sovereign wealth funds. And the cost of picking the wrong side can erase a generation of progress. Whether this is a return to the pre-1500 norm or something nobody's seen before, the data doesn't really say. As always. But pawns are already moving. And the check is coming in.